The bowl was set before her with a thud, the sound sharp against the silence of the evening. Kinna looked down into the dark, soupy scraps, bones already sucked clean, a watery mess that carried a faint, bitter smell. Her stomach twisted with hunger, yet her nose told her that once again, the food had been touched by more than salt and smoke. She knew it too well by now, the faint metallic sting that clung to her throat with every swallow, the burn that came hours later. Poison. Her stepmother, seated on the mat above her, leaned back with satisfaction. Eat, child. Do not waste the blessings given to you. Her voice dripped with mockery, and the two stepsisters at her side giggled, tearing into their roasted meat and soft yams with oily fingers. Their plates were heavy, steaming, fragrant with real food, while Kinna sat cross-legged on the ground, clutching the wooden bowl as though it were treasure. The girl's hands shook. She was 12, maybe 13, her frame thin enough to look like shadow. Yet she lifted the spoon, and as she placed the first bite into her mouth, she forced herself not to gag. The poison burned against her tongue, bitter, stinging as though she were swallowing smoke-turned liquid. She chewed slowly, her throat aching with each push downward. Her stepsisters leaned closer to watch, their eyes glowing with cruel delight. "See how her lips turn black," one whispered. "See how she shivers." Kinna's body betrayed her, it did shiver, her hands trembling as sweat collected at her brow. Her belly clenched, her ribs tightening against the pain. Still she swallowed again and again. Every mouthful was war, but hunger was stronger. The stepmother's eyes were sharp as knives. She wanted to see weakness. She wanted to see the child collapse, fall silent forever like a goat whose throat had been cut. But when Kinna raised her head, coughing hard until blood spotted her lips, she met those eyes with her own, dark, unbroken, and steady. The stepmother shifted, unsettled by that look. "One day she will not rise again," she muttered, reaching for more meat as if to drown her unease in taste. Kinna bent over her bowl, coughing into the crook of her arm. The blood was bright, vivid against her skin, and her chest burned as though a fire had caught inside her lungs. But she kept eating. She had no choice. To refuse the food was to starve, to eat it was to suffer. Between those two cruelties she chose survival, even if survival meant pain. Each evening repeated the same torment. Scraps laced with bitterness, eyes watching for her collapse, laughter ringing in her ears. In the mornings she awoke weak, her stomach turning with nausea, her mouth dry, her throat raw. She moved through the day as though carrying stones inside her. The villagers saw her stumbling, pale and thin, and whispered, "That one will not last long. Her spirit is already halfway gone." But they did not see her in the moments of solitude, when she clutched her chest and spat blood into the dust, only to rise again trembling but alive. They did not see the stubborn spark in her eyes as she whispered to herself, "Not yet. Not yet." Her stepsisters delighted in the game. They leaned over her as she ate, whispering the names of the herbs their mother had mixed into the bowl, taunting her with details of how each one destroyed the body. One for the belly, one for the lungs, one for the blood. They watched as her lips cracked, as her breath turned shallow, waiting for her to give in. But Kinna's spirit clung to life with claws sharper than they knew. Her frame bent but did not break. Her skin burned with fever, yet her gaze never dulled. Even as she coughed blood onto the floor, even as her throat felt raw enough to tear, she raised her head and looked at them, a girl nearly broken, yet somehow defiant. The house filled with the sound of their laughter each night, cruel and sharp. Yet beneath it was another sound, quieter but stronger, the beating of her heart, steady, insistent, refusing to stop. They thought they were watching her die. What they were truly watching was the slow shaping of something they could not yet name, something far more dangerous than death. The smell of roasted goat filled the house that evening, thick and rich, clinging to the rafters. Spices drifted through the air, the sweetness of ground peppers, the smoky char of meat roasted over slow flames. Kinna sat on the floor by the doorway, her hands wrapped around her knees as her stomach tightened with sharp, hollow pain. She had not eaten since the poisoned scraps of the night before. On the central mat, her stepmother and stepsisters sat in luxury, their plates piled high with steaming food. Fat dripped down their fingers and they licked it greedily, laughing between mouthfuls. Their voices blended with the sound of chewing, tearing, gulping, and sighs of satisfaction. Kinna's mouth watered despite herself, and her throat tightened with longing. Her stepmother turned her head, smirking. "Ah, how can a girl sit so close to heaven and yet live in hell?" She reached into the pot, pulled out a piece of juicy meat, and waved it in the air just long enough for the smell to reach Kinna's nostrils before tossing it into her own mouth. Kinna lowered her gaze. Soon, a bowl was shoved toward her, A cracked clay bowl filled with brown water, fragments of yam skin floating on the surface, and bones already gnawed clean. Bits of rot clung to the edges, the liquid sour with age. She forced her hands to take it, though every part of her body screamed in protest. Her stepsisters leaned closer, whispering so she could hear. Do you think she was born cursed? Or perhaps she did something to deserve it? Why else would mother feed her poison every night? Their laughter was cruel, like the snapping of dry twigs. Kinna lifted the bowl to her lips. The smell nearly made her retch. Still, she drank, swallowing the sour rot as tears gathered in her eyes. The poison lingered beneath the surface. She knew its taste now, the faint bitterness that stayed on the tongue long after the food was gone. She had learned to endure it, though each sip sent a shiver through her chest. At the edges of the village, whispers spread like smoke. The girl is sick, the women said at the water well. She coughs blood, her body bends like dry grass. Surely she carries some hidden sin. The men at the marketplace muttered, why does she not die? Poison has been poured into her bowl for seasons, yet she still walks. The children, bold and cruel, sang songs as she passed. Kinna eats death, Kinna drinks rot, Kinna's belly burns, but Kinna dies not. They scattered stones at her feet, laughing when she stumbled. She bore it in silence. Hunger wrapped around her like a second skin, heavy and constant. Her ribs pressed against her skin, her limbs were thin as sticks, and her lips cracked until blood touched them. Yet she endured, clutching every breath as though it were the last ember of a dying fire. At night, when the house grew silent, Kinna lay on her mat with her belly gnawing itself. Sleep was thin, broken by dreams of food. But in her dreams, the food was not just sustenance, it was dignity, a feast where she sat tall, her plate full, while others waited in silence for her hand. She imagined breaking thick loaves of bread, biting into ripe fruit, drinking milk until her thirst was quenched. In her dreams she was not mocked, not poisoned, not starving. In her dreams she was whole. Each morning she woke with her stomach aching worse than before, the poison still burning in her veins. Yet her eyes carried a light that hunger could not steal. It was faint, buried deep, but it was there. She clung to that light, whispering to herself words no one else would hear, I am more than what they feed me. One day they will know. The house was full of abundance, yet she lived in famine. The stepmother's pots overflowed with grains, meats and milk, but for Kinna only rot and poison. Every day the ritual repeated until it became more than cruelty, it became the rhythm of her life. Hunger gnawed, poison burned, whispers haunted, but still she breathed. Still she endured. And though her body weakened, her spirit did not. Hunger and poison had become her daily companions, but in the quietest corners of her soul, Kinna dreamed of a table where she would no longer beg for scraps, where others would eat what she placed before them. The night was colder than most, the kind of cold that seemed to crawl into Kinna's bones and settle there. She sat in the corner of the house, clutching her bowl of scraps as the others finished their feast. The room smelled of roasted yam and goat fat, but in her bowl floated little more than rotting leaves, a few shreds of skin, and that bitter sting she knew too well. The poison was there, silent and invisible, waiting to burn its way through her veins again. Her stepmother glanced at her with narrowed eyes. Eat, she ordered, her voice flat as if she were addressing a stray dog. Do not waste what is given to you. Kinna obeyed. She lifted the first spoonful to her lips, gagging as the sour taste filled her mouth. She coughed, the liquid spilling down her chin, leaving her throat raw. The stepsisters laughed loudly, their voices echoing against the clay walls. She cannot even swallow water without choking. How does such a creature still walk? The sound of their laughter faded as Kinna forced herself to swallow again. Her chest burned, her belly twisted, and her head swam. It was too much this time. She bent forward, heaving, her body trembling violently. She thought she would collapse right there on the floor. And then, as the poison seemed to close her throat, she heard it. A voice. Soft at first, like a breath rising from the bowl in her hands. It was not the stepmother's voice, nor her sister's, nor any villager outside. It was a woman's voice, low, familiar, carrying a warmth she had not felt in years. Kinna. She froze, the spoon clattering against the side of the bowl. Her eyes darted around the room, but no one had spoken. Her stepmother was already leaving for her sleeping mat, the sisters whispering to each other in the dark. Only Kinna remained awake, staring into the foul broth. The voice rose again, steady this time. Kinna, my child, do not fear. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew that voice. She knew it from dreams, from fading memories of soft lullabies sung in the quiet hours of night, before her mother had died. her eyes filled with tears. "Mother?" she whispered, so faintly that even she could barely hear it. "Yes," the voice answered, carried on the bitter steam of the poisoned food. "They think they are killing you, my child. But listen well, the poison does not end you. It remakes you." Kinna's hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the bowl. Her mother's spirit? Speaking to her from rotten venom? Her lips trembled. I do not understand." "Every drop they have forced into you has changed you," the voice said, calm but firm like thunder rolling beneath the earth. "Your blood now carries what they fed you. Where it should kill, it gives you strength. Where it should burn, it hardens you. The poison is no longer your enemy, it is your fire." Kinna's mind swirled. She remembered the way her body no longer collapsed, even after seasons of poison. She remembered the strange resilience in her veins, the way she could rise again after coughing blood, the way her eyes remained clear when they should have dulled. Her mother's voice grew stronger. "Your breath carries venom. Your touch, resistance. What was meant to destroy you is now your power. They think you are weak, but you are more dangerous than they know. Do not forget this, Kinna. Endure a little longer. The day will come when you shall feed them what they have fed you." The words wrapped around her like a cloak, and for the first time in years she felt something greater than hunger or pain. She felt a spark, a promise of power sleeping beneath her skin. She leaned closer to the bowl as though afraid the voice would vanish. "But why now, mother? Why do you speak only tonight?" The broth shivered, though the air was still. The whisper returned, softer, almost sorrowful. "Because tonight you were close to crossing. The poison nearly claimed you, and in that place between life and death, my voice can reach you. But you are not meant to die in silence, my child. You are meant to rise in fire." Kinna clutched the bowl to her chest, weeping silently. For so long she had carried only loneliness, only hunger, only humiliation. But now her mother's voice, alive in the very thing that should have killed her, gave her a truth stronger than any she had known. She was not merely surviving, she was transforming. The room was dark, the stepmother and sisters asleep. Kinna sat alone, the taste of poison still burning her throat. But instead of despair, she felt her lips curl into the faintest smile. Her blood was no longer theirs to kill. It was hers to wield. She whispered into the night, her voice steady despite the tears. "I will endure, mother. And one day I will feed them what they fed me." The bowl trembled in her hands, and for a moment she thought she saw a faint shimmer of light ripple across the surface of the poisoned broth, like a fire flickering in the dark. The days that followed were different, though the routine had not changed. The poisoned bowls still came, the mocking laughter still cut her ears, and hunger still twisted her stomach like cruel ropes. Yet beneath her skin, something new stirred. Kinna first noticed it one morning as she leaned over the water basin to wash her face. The water reflected a thin, starved girl, ribs pushing against her chest, lips cracked from thirst. But her hair, once dull and lifeless, now gleamed strangely under the weak sunlight. It was darker than before, black as obsidian, yet glimmering like polished stone. She touched it with trembling fingers, pulling a strand forward. It shimmered as though the light bent around it, an unnatural sheen that frightened even her. That night, when she curled on her mat, she awoke to find her skin glowing faintly where the moonlight touched. At first she thought it was a trick of her weary eyes, but when she pressed her hand to her arm she saw them clearly, thin lines glowing beneath her flesh, faint but real. Her veins pulsed with a dim, silvery light, like molten threads running through her blood. She yanked her sleeve down quickly, terrified her stepmother might see. And she was right to fear, for animals had already noticed. The chickens that once scratched at the dirt near her feet now scattered whenever she approached. The family's goats, usually greedy and unafraid, would bleat nervously and tug their ropes when she came near, their eyes wide with an instinctive terror. Even stray dogs that used to sniff at her scraps now growled low, hackles raised, before fleeing into the night. The villagers too began to sense something strange. Children who once pelted her with stones no longer dared to come too close. Their songs faltered into whispers, and though they still taunted from afar, their feet carried them quickly away when her eyes met theirs. Her stepmother, however, refused to see the truth. Each evening she pushed forward the poisoned bowl, convinced that her patience would soon be rewarded. "It is working," she would mutter to her daughters, eyes fixed on Kinna's trembling hands. "Look how thin she grows. Look at the shadows under her eyes. Soon she will crumble like ash." But the stepmother did not notice the shimmer in Kinna's hair. She did not see how the girl's eyes, though sunken, burned with strange clarity. She ignored the way Kinna coughed blood yet still rose, her steps shaky but unstoppable. To the stepmother, these were signs of death approaching, not transformation blooming. Kinna herself felt the change every time she swallowed the bitter broth. The burn no longer left her gasping for breath, it spread like a hot wave, then settled into her bones, leaving her stronger. The nausea still came, the coughing still tore at her throat, but each time she endured, she rose quicker than before. She could feel something gathering inside her, a force humming in her veins, quiet but relentless. At night, she lay awake listening to her mother's whispered words echo in her mind. What was meant to destroy you is your fire. She pressed her hands to her chest, feeling the faint glow under her skin, and for the first time, the thought of poison did not bring fear, it brought a strange comfort. But the villagers were not blind forever. One evening, when Kinna was sent to fetch water, a woman at the well dropped her bucket and gasped. Her eyes, she whispered, pointing with a trembling hand. Did you see them? They shine like embers in the dark. Another woman nodded quickly, pulling her child close. Her veins glow. I saw it when the moonlight touched her arm. She carries death inside her. She is not human anymore. The whisper spread quickly through the village, carried from mouth to mouth until every household knew. The poisoned child glows in the night, they said. She walks with death in her blood. Children no longer sang taunts when she passed, they hid behind their mothers' skirts. Men at the market fell silent as she walked by, watching her from the corners of their eyes. The space around her grew empty, as though even the air recoiled from her presence. Kinna noticed it all. She saw how even shadows seemed thicker where she stood, how silence followed her like a second shadow. Part of her feared it, for she was still only a girl, lonely and hungry. But another part, the part that remembered her mother's words, understood. She was no longer just surviving their cruelty. She was becoming something beyond it. Her stepmother, blind with pride, saw none of this. Each evening she placed the poisoned bowl before Kinna and sneered. Eat and be grateful, she said. And Kinna did eat, bowing her head, hiding her faint smile. She swallowed the poison that should have killed her, feeling it slip into her veins, feeding the light beneath her skin. What they thought was weakness was no longer weakness. It was change. It was power. It was myth growing in the bones of a girl they thought they had broken. The season of harvest came early that year, and with it came the festival of feasts, a celebration the village awaited with hungry bellies and greedy eyes. It was the time when every household was required to present its best dish before the chief, so that the abundance of the land might be honored and the gods appeased. The air was already thick with anticipation. Smoke curled above rooftops, and the smell of roasted meats and stews drifted through the dusty lanes. Drums beat faintly in the distance, summoning joy. But for Kinna, joy was a language she had long forgotten. When the announcement reached her stepmother's compound, the woman clapped her hands in false delight. Kinna, she said, her voice sharp as the knife she waved, you will cook for us. The chief's eyes will see our household's greatness, and he will never know the hands that prepared it belonged to a girl not fit to eat from the dog's dish. The stepsisters laughed, tossing their braids and whispering like hyenas circling prey. Kinna bowed her head, not from obedience, but to hide the shadow of a smile tugging at her lips. For years she had bent over pots, stirring bitterness into food that never filled her. For years her stepmother's mockery had been poured into her ears like boiling oil. But this time, something in her chest stirred, an ember that refused to die. She washed the calabash bowls, polished the blackened pots, and went to the market to gather what little her stepmother gave her coin for. A slab of goat meat, handfuls of spices, and dried peppers that burned her fingers when she ground them. Her stepsisters trailed behind, taunting her. Careful not to lick your fingers, rat, one said. The poison in your blood might ruin the food. They cackled, their laughter echoing like cracked gourds. Kinna ignored them. Her hands moved with a rhythm as old as her mother's teachings. She sliced, pounded, and stirred, her body swaying unconsciously to the beat of the pestle against mortar. The meat simmered, fat bubbling to the surface, while the peppers released a smoke that made her eyes water. As the stew thickened, Kinna leaned close. The heat rose from the pot, wrapping around her face, and within the haze she heard it, the same whisper that had once risen from her poisoned bowl. Child, the voice murmured, soft as the rustle of leaves in midnight wind. Do you see how their poison has filled you? Do you see how your suffering has ripened? What they fed you to destroy you, you may now return. Kinna's hands trembled on the spoon. She stirred slower, her lips parted as though drinking the spirit's words like broth. For the first time she did not look at the food with hunger clawing her belly. She looked at it with power humming in her veins. Behind her, the stepmother sat watching, her eyes sharp, her face twisted in suspicion. "Stir faster, you lazy child," she barked. "The feast begins at sundown, and we must not look shameful before the chief." "Yes, mother," Kinna replied, though the word dripped with venom. She stirred faster, but now every movement had meaning. With each turn of the spoon, she thought of the nights she had coughed blood onto her sleeping mat, her body racked with pain while her stepsisters giggled in the next room. With each sprinkle of spice, she remembered the taste of rot forced down her throat, the sting of poison in her belly. She whispered her suffering into the pot, and the stew began to thicken with something unseen. As she worked, her body betrayed subtle changes. The sheen of her hair glistened under firelight like obsidian wet with rain. A faint glow traced her veins, hidden but restless beneath her skin. The air around her seemed to shift. Even the flies that once hovered near raw meat darted away, fleeing her presence. The stepmother saw none of it. She only saw a girl she believed still chained to misery, still crawling in obedience. "Be sure to salt it well," she sneered. "If the chief spits out our food, I will make you lick the dirt from his sandals." Kinna did not answer. Instead, she leaned over the pot, her smile faint but sharp. Her reflection rippled in the bubbling stew, and for the first time she did not see a starving child. She saw fire wrapped in flesh, a girl carved from hunger and poison, her eyes holding storms the village was not ready to face. The stepsisters, full from snacking on roasted plantains, came to peer into the pot. "Look at her," one whispered. "She cooks like she believes she will taste it." Foolish rat. But Kinna did not flinch at their words. She tasted something deeper, the savor of justice brewing, the bitter and sweet flavors of revenge melding like pepper and honey. The smell of the stew was rich and intoxicating. Even the sisters, mocking as they were, could not hide their greed as they licked their lips. By the time the sun dipped low, staining the sky with crimson streaks, the pot was ready. Villagers began to carry dishes to the square, their laughter echoing through the air. Kinna wiped her hands on her tattered wrapper and set the steaming pot before her stepmother. "It is done," she said softly. The woman glanced into it, smirking. "You did not even taste it, did you?" "Of course not. It is not yours to eat." Kinna lowered her gaze, though her smile lingered where no one could see. The spirit's whisper echoed in her ear once more. "Child, tonight they will feed from your suffering. Tonight their last meal begins." And for the first time in years, Kinna let herself smile at the pot. The festival square roared with life. Torches flared against the darkening sky, casting long shadows that swayed across the ground. The drums beat with steady hands, their rhythm pulsing through the air, while voices rose in song to welcome the season of feasting. Every household had laid down bowls and calabashes of their finest meals, rich stews, roasted meats, honeyed cakes, gourds of palm wine, all offerings meant to dazzle the chief's eye and please the gods. But in one corner of the square, a girl in rags bent over a single steaming pot. Her stepmother strutted proudly before it, boasting to anyone who passed. "Ah, this dish will outshine them all. My hands prepared it, my skill made it sing. Wait until the chief tastes it, he will remember our household." The villagers nodded politely, though some cast glances at Kinna, their eyes sliding over her gaunt figure with disdain. Was it not the same girl they had seen scavenging scraps? The same one whispered to carry misfortune in her shadow? Surely she had no part in this glorious display. She remained silent, her head lowered, her hands folded over her knees. Yet within her chest, something thrummed. Her blood was hot, her veins alive with the venom that had refused to kill her. The stew before her simmered gently, the surface bubbling as though it recognized her presence. She picked up the spoon and stirred, her voice rising softly in song. At first it was barely more than a hum, a fragile sound like the hush of wind through tall grass. But slowly it grew, carrying a melody the villagers had never heard before. Her tone was sweet, laced with a dangerous beauty that made even those who tried to ignore her pause for a heartbeat. The words were old, older than memory, carried from her mother's lips into hers. "What you fed me I return. What you poured into me I pour back. What you sought to kill lives now in my veins." Her stepmother glanced at her sharply, but Kinna only stirred, her face blank. The sisters laughed nervously. "She sings like a child still begging for food," one muttered. "Let her sing. Her voice is nothing." But it was not nothing. Each note wrapped itself around the pot, thickening the air above it. The stew's aroma grew heavy, richer than before, intoxicating. As Kinna sang, she set down the spoon and dipped her bare hands into the bubbling broth. The heat did not scald her. The liquid parted around her fingers as though welcoming its mistress. She held her palms above it, and from her skin flowed the essence of her blood, dark, invisible streams of venom lacing into the food. The spirit of her mother whispered in her ear, guiding her. Do not fear what you are. Let them eat what they made of you. Let their laughter turn to silence. And so Kinna stirred with her own hands, her song rising higher, soft but sure. The torches crackled. The drums faltered for a breath. Even the night seemed to lean closer. Her stepmother, blind in her arrogance, clapped her hands to summon her daughters. Come, it is time to eat. We must not look weak before the chief. Let us taste our dish first so we know it is perfect. The sisters rushed forward, greedy as always. Their bracelets jingled, their laughter sharp. They scooped steaming ladles into their bowls, the aroma making their mouths water. At last, one said, "Meat richer than bones." They blew on the broth only long enough not to burn their lips, then began to eat. The stepmother joined them, smacking her lips loudly. "Perfect," she declared. "Ah, the chief will love it." Kinna sat quietly, her eyes lowered, but her song did not cease. Each word folded into the air as her family swallowed mouthful after mouthful. She watched their faces flush with heat, their gulps quickening. They licked the bowls, scraping for every drop. Then the first cough came. One of the sisters froze, her spoon clattering against the ground. Her eyes bulged and her hands clutched at her throat. She coughed again, this time splattering red into her bowl. The other sister laughed nervously at first, until her own breath caught short. Her laughter turned into a wheeze, her body folding as though crushed from within. The stepmother looked between them, horror dawning in her eyes. What is this?" she shrieked. She staggered to her feet, clutching her belly as if stabbed. She turned toward Kinna, who now lifted her head for the first time. Her eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, black as midnight with veins of silver tracing their edges. The smile that touched her lips was not cruel, but it was final. "You fed me poison every day," Kinna whispered, her voice carrying like a curse across the square. "And now it returns to you." The sisters collapsed first, their bodies writhing, mouths frothing as the venom that had lived in Kinna poured through them. Their nails scraped the earth, their screams echoing. The villagers gasped, some stepping back, others crossing themselves in fear. The stepmother staggered, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, no, this cannot be." She fell to her knees, her body shaking violently. The bowl slipped from her hands, spilling stew into the dirt. She reached toward Kinna with trembling fingers as though begging for mercy. But Kinna did not move. Her song had stopped, but its echo lingered in the ears of all who heard it. One final convulsion shook the woman and then silence. Her body slumped, her face frozen in terror. The sisters lay lifeless beside her, their once proud forms reduced to nothing but husks of greed. The square was silent. The villagers stared, their faces pale in the torchlight. Whispers rose, trembling, "The poisoned child, she killed them with what they fed her, her blood, her voice." Kinna stood slowly, her thin frame swaying slightly but unbroken. The pot still simmered behind her, its surface calm now, as if satisfied. She wiped her wet hands on her ragged wrapper, lifted her chin, and looked not at her family's corpses but at the crowd that watched. "They gave me death every day," she said, her voice steady. "I gave them back what was theirs." Her words hung heavy, carried by the firelight and the smoke. No one dared to move. Some feared her, others pitied her, but none could deny the truth. The girl they had mocked, starved, and ignored had become something untouchable, wrapped in fire, breathing poison, a living myth. And as she walked away from the bodies, the villagers parted before her, silent as the grave. The square that had roared with laughter now trembled with silence. The bodies of Kinna's stepmother and sisters lay twisted on the ground, their mouths open in screams that would never end. The stew pot still steamed, the aroma rich and tempting, as if mocking those who dared to breathe it in. The villagers stood frozen at first, eyes darting between the corpses and the girl who had walked away from them untouched. But hunger is a beast that blinds, and suspicion a shadow that creeps only after greed has been sated. One man whispered, "Perhaps it was not poison at all. Perhaps they choked. Perhaps—" His words trailed as his nose flared at the smell of the stew. His stomach growled audibly. It would be a waste to throw it away. Another, bolder, stepped forward with a grin that tried to mask his unease. "The chief demands every household bring food. This pot is still full. Why should we let death scare us from meat as tender as this?" The whispers spread like brushfire. Hunger gnawed at them and curiosity licked their minds. Hadn't they laughed when Kinna's stepmother mocked her? Hadn't they turned their heads when the girl was forced to kneel in ashes, coughing blood? To them she was less than a shadow. If she could cook such a pot, surely it was worth tasting. One by one they edged closer, bowls in hand. Kinna watched from the edge of the square, her face expressionless. She did not sing this time. She did not need to. The pot no longer belonged to her, it belonged to everything she had endured. The first villager dipped his ladle, filling his bowl with broth and meat. He slurped greedily, smacking his lips. "Delicious," he said, his grin wide. "See? No death here." Encouraged, others rushed forward, scooping steaming portions into their bowls. They ate with noisy mouths, laughing to chase away the unease in their chests. But laughter turns to screams faster than the blink of an eye. It began with the bold one. He dropped his bowl, clutching his belly. His knees buckled as a howl tore from his throat. He clawed at the ground, eyes bulging, foam spilling from his lips. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but before anyone could step back, two more collapsed. A woman staggered, her hands shaking, her face twisting as blood bubbled at her mouth. Another man vomited violently, red staining the dust. Panic erupted. Bowls clattered to the earth, stew spilling like blood across the dirt. The square filled with screams as those who had laughed at Kinna's misery writhed on the ground. One by one, their bodies convulsed, their faces contorted into grotesque masks of agony. Their laughter curdled into cries for mercy, but none came. The air was filled with choking sounds, with curses shouted to the gods, with prayers cut short by blood. The festival's music, once triumphant, faltered into silence as the drummers dropped their sticks, staring in horror at the chaos unfolding. Kinna did not move. She stood as still as a carved idol, her eyes watching, her chest rising and falling with slow breaths. The firelight flickered against her skin, painting her in shadows and flame. Around her, the village that had once spat on her name collapsed, writhing in the dirt they had forced her to eat from. The chief's guards rushed forward, spears raised, but even they froze as their fellows, those who had snatched tastes of the stew before duty pulled them away, fell with twisted faces, clutching at their throats. Some guards staggered back, their eyes wide with fear. Others dropped to their knees, their bodies betraying them, their screams echoing into the night. The feast had become a funeral. Villagers who had not eaten fled from the square, their feet pounding against the earth as they dragged children behind them. Cries filled the air, wails of grief, shrieks of terror. Torches toppled in the chaos, and soon fire spread through the festival stalls, devouring baskets of grain and gourds of palm wine. Smoke billowed, black and heavy, swallowing the stars above. The chief himself appeared, drawn by the screams. He was a tall man, robed in crimson, his headdress of feathers swaying as he stormed into the square. His eyes widened at the carnage before him, the ground littered with bodies, some twitching, some already still, all bearing faces twisted in death. "What madness is this?" he roared, his voice carrying above the cries. His gaze fell on Kinna, who stood at the edge of it all, her rags fluttering in the wind, her eyes burning with something both human and not. The villagers who remained pointed trembling fingers. "It is her. The poison girl. She cursed the food. She killed them all." The chief's gaze hardened. "You," he said, his voice like thunder. "What have you done?" Kinna lifted her chin slowly. The firelight caught the sheen of her obsidian hair, the faint glow of her veins. "I did nothing," she said, her voice calm but heavy as stone. "I only fed them what they fed me." The chief's face darkened, but before he could speak, another scream tore through the night. More villagers collapsed, their limbs jerking violently. The ground seemed to drink their suffering, their cries rising in a chorus of agony. Kinna stepped forward, her bare feet leaving faint prints that glowed for a heartbeat before fading. She looked at the chief, then at the villagers who still stood trembling. "Do you see now?" she said, her words soft but carrying across the square. "You all laughed while I starved. You all turned away while they fed me poison. You thought my suffering was nothing." Her eyes swept over the dying. "Now it is something." The chief's guards hesitated. None dared to touch her. The flames from the toppled torches grew higher, circling the square, casting long shadows that seemed to bow before her. The cries of the dying rose and fell like waves, each one a testimony to years of cruelty returned in a single night. The feast had ended, but the gods had not been appeased. They had been awakened. And through Kinna's voice, through her blood, their wrath had come to the village. When the last scream faded and only the crackle of fire remained, the survivors looked upon her with fear carved into their faces. Where there had been a girl once mocked and starved, there now stood something else, part flesh, part vengeance, her very presence burning into memory. The festival of feasts would never be spoken of as a celebration again. It would be remembered only as the night the food turned to fire, the laughter turned to screams, and Kina, the poison girl, gave the village its last supper. The fires burned long into the night, their smoke rising like black pillars that blotted out the stars. The drums had gone silent. The laughter, the singing, the boasting, all of it had been swallowed by the cries of the dying, leaving behind only the crackle of flame and the stench of spilled stew mingling with blood. Those who had survived huddled together at the edges of the square, their faces pale, their eyes wide, their lips trembling with fear. Some clutched their children to their chests, shielding their eyes from the sight of twisted bodies strewn across the earth. Others hid their faces in their hands, whispering frantic prayers to gods who had remained silent. And in the center of it all stood Kina. She was no longer hunched, no longer bowed. Her thin frame, once shrunken by years of starvation, seemed taller, straighter, as if the venom in her veins had carved her into something unbreakable. Her hair shimmered like strands of black stone, catching the firelight in glints of obsidian. The faint glow beneath her skin pulsed with every heartbeat, veins of silver and ash that made her look both alive and not. The villagers' whispers rose, shaking. She is not human. She is the spirit of poison. She is the child of death. Finally, a trembling voice called out, "She is the daughter of poison." The words hung in the smoky air, carried like a curse, like a title. And Kina, standing among the dead, did not flinch. She did not shake her head or lift her voice in denial. She simply stood still, her calm face glowing faintly in the firelight, and her silence was answer enough. The survivors fell to their knees, their foreheads pressing into the dirt. Some wept. Some trembled. Others dared not look at her at all. For years they had mocked her, calling her cursed, a shadow, a mouth unworthy of food. But now they saw her not as a starving girl but as a living omen. A child who had eaten death every day and carried it within her until it grew into something unstoppable. Kina walked forward slowly, her bare feet brushing against the dust. She did not quicken her pace, nor did she look hurried. Each step was measured, calm, as though she had always belonged in the silence of reverence. She stepped over the corpses of her stepmother and sisters, their mouths still frozen in the agony of their last screams. She stepped past the villagers who had stolen food from her hands, who had spat at her as she begged. She passed them all, her face serene, her gaze unbroken. And though she said nothing, her silence was heavier than words. Everywhere she walked, the survivors lowered their eyes. Mothers hushed their children, men bowed their heads. None dared to speak her name. Only the whispered title followed her, the daughter of poison. She crossed the village paths, where the huts leaned close together, and the shadows of the dead seemed to linger just beyond the flicker of flame. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and charred food, but to Kina, it carried no weight. She had lived with the stink of poison, the rot of spoiled scraps, the taste of ash in her mouth. The scents of death and ruin were not foreign to her. They were the only perfume she had ever known. Her eyes fell on familiar faces among the survivors. There was the woman who had once poured water onto the dirt rather than share a drink with her. There was the man who had laughed when her stepmother forced her to eat from the dog's bowl. There were children who had thrown stones at her and run off, chanting that she was cursed. Now those same faces bent low to the ground, trembling, desperate not to meet her gaze. Kina did not speak to them. She did not curse them nor bless them. She walked past, her silence sharper than a blade. In their fear, they heard judgment louder than words could carry. The glow beneath her skin pulsed brighter as she reached the center of the village, where the shrine to the ancestors stood. The carved wooden figures watched her with hollow eyes, their faces cracked by time. For years she had knelt there, begging for mercy, asking for food, pleading for her suffering to end. For years the shrine had given her nothing but silence. Now she stood before it, no longer pleading, no longer begging. She lifted her chin, her obsidian hair spilling down her back, and the faint silver in her veins shimmered like lightning beneath her skin. The survivors watched from a distance, too afraid to draw close, but unable to look away. Kina did not bow. She did not kneel. She simply stood, her eyes fixed on the shrine, and for a heartbeat the air seemed to thicken, as though even the ancestors dared not breathe. The firelight danced across her face, painting her in shifting hues of flame and shadow, of flesh and spirit. The villagers whispered again, their voices quivering. She is no longer ours. She belongs to the fire. She walks with poison in her veins, and the earth cannot refuse her. But among the whispers came a new sound, a note of reverence, of awe. For as much as they feared her, as much as they trembled in her presence, they could not deny the truth. Kina had risen from the ashes of their cruelty. She had endured the poison they poured into her, and she had become it. She had been their victim, but now she was their myth. The daughter of poison. She turned from the shrine, her face calm, her eyes steady. She began to walk again, this time toward the edge of the village. The survivors parted before her like grass before the wind, bowing their heads, pressing their foreheads into the dust. Some whispered prayers as she passed, begging her not to curse them, begging her to leave them with their lives. Kina said nothing. She owed them no words. Her silence was her answer, her calm face her only gift. She stepped over the bodies, past the huts, through the paths where once she had crawled in hunger. Every step was a claiming, not of vengeance now but of identity. She was no longer the girl who coughed blood in the ashes. She was no longer the shadow mocked by children and spat on by women. She was no longer a victim. She was the daughter of poison, and the village would never forget her name. The village that had once roared with laughter, filled with the clatter of calabashes and the smoke of roasting meats, now moved like a place holding its breath. Silence draped the air heavier than any storm cloud. Those who remained alive whispered in corners, glancing at each other with suspicion, as though poison swam not just in food but in every look, every shared word. No pot was stirred without trembling hands. No morsel was swallowed without hesitation. The sound of chewing had become as terrifying as the sound of mourning. Hunger hung over them like a curse, though stores of food were still piled high. The people no longer trusted their own kitchens. The memory of watching neighbors convulse and fall from the feast gnawed at them. Women went to the river to wash cassava, yet returned without cooking it. Men slaughtered goats but left their carcasses untouched, rotting in the heat. The children, once so loud in play, pressed their backs against their mother's skirts and asked in hushed tones, "Is it safe, Mama?" The mothers had no answers. At the center of this hollow village sat Kina, alone in the same hut where she had been starved, mocked, and poisoned for so long. But she was no longer the trembling girl who coughed blood into her bowl. She was something else entirely. Her body felt light, yet strong, as if the venom in her veins had woven itself into bone and marrow. Her reflection in a clay water pot showed eyes that no longer looked like a child's. They glowed faintly, holding within them the shimmer of fireflies caught at dusk. And for the first time Kina prepared a meal for herself. She did not hide in a corner, waiting for scraps or smothered laughter. She built a fire that licked high into the air, flames bending toward her as if bowing in allegiance. She took yams, groundnuts, and strips of dried meat, real food untouched by anyone else's hands, and set them into the pot. The steam rose, carrying the scent of life and strength. Her stomach clenched, but not with fear. With hunger, pure and sharp, the kind she had been denied for years. When she sat to eat, there was no one beside her. No stepmother sneering, no stepsisters giggling, no villagers peeking through the door to call her cursed. Just her and the silence of a land holding its breath. She lifted the first bite to her lips, and as it touched her tongue, something inside her shifted. It was more than food. It was reclamation. Every swallow filled her with the memory of her suffering, and yet with triumph as well. She could feel the food sliding into a body that was no longer simply flesh but a vessel of resistance, of vengeance, of fire. Her veins pulsed with power and her skin shimmered faintly in the firelight. She smiled through the glow of her eyes, and the silence of the village seemed to tighten around her hut. They watched from a distance. Men who once jeered at her thin frame, women who once turned their backs on her suffering, they stood in shadows, afraid to be seen, afraid even of their own hunger. Every rumble of their stomachs was a reminder of her. Every pang was Kina's silent laugh echoing inside them. Days passed, and though food was everywhere, the people wasted away. Fear was the true famine now. It stretched its fingers into every home, coiling around every family. Kina, however, did not waste. She grew stronger, radiant even, her body humming with something that could no longer be called human. The land itself seemed to recoil. Birds no longer descended upon the fields to peck at the grain. Goats bleated nervously, refusing to eat from their troughs. Even the wind carried a sour scent, as though touched by the breath of poison. At night, the air was heavy, and villagers swore they saw the soil glow faintly beneath the moonlight, as if the earth itself had swallowed her venom. When Kina finished her meal, the first real meal of her life, she set down the empty bowl. She felt no need to wipe her mouth, no need to hide. She leaned back, watching the flames, and let her glowing eyes rest on the shadows outside. The survivors lowered their gazes, trembling. In their hearts, they knew, hunger was no longer their punishment. Fear was. and fear like poison would never leave them. Kinna smiled softly, and though no crown rested on her head, the silence of the land, the trembling of its people, and the glow in her eyes became her coronation. The story of that night did not die with the screams. It walked, it crawled, it whispered itself into every home and hearth. Children who once giggled at Kinna's torn clothes and sunken eyes, now sang in hushed tones, "Beware the girl who fed her poison back, beware the child they tried to starve." Their small voices carried the warning through the air like smoke, haunting the ears of parents who hushed them quickly, as though even repeating her tale might summon her shadow. Families that had once turned a blind eye to cruelty grew cautious. When orphans passed through villages, when stepchildren knelt to sweep floors or begged for food, hands hesitated. Mothers pulled pots closer and muttered, "Give them a share, lest the child of poison hears of us." Fathers lowered their voices, warning their sons and daughters never to laugh at hunger, never to mock a weak girl, for even weakness could hold fire. The villagers who survived never forgot the sight of Kinna's eyes glowing in the firelight as she ate her first true meal. That vision etched itself into their bones. Some swore they saw her shadow stretching longer than the flames, reaching past the hut, past the fields, toward the horizon itself. And then she was gone. One morning, a woman drawing water from the river swore she saw Kinna walking across the bank, her figure tall, her steps slow, as though carrying the weight of every poison meal she had swallowed. The air shimmered around her, like heat rising from hot stones. She did not look back. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until the horizon swallowed her whole. Yet her absence was heavier than her presence had ever been. Her story became the meal that never ended, feeding whispers, feeding warnings, feeding fear. The land itself seemed changed. Cassava tasted bitter, yams turned the stomach, and even fresh goat milk carried a sour tang. People chewed carefully, wondering if her spirit had slipped into their bowls, waiting. Children grew up with her story as a lullaby, a threat, and a prayer. Don't starve your blood, don't poison your kin, lest the girl of poison return again. Travelers carried it to other villages, weaving it into fireside tales. In every version, Kinna remained the same, a girl who took what killed her and turned it into the crown of her survival. But no one could say where she went. Some whispered she had become part of the forest, walking among the trees, her breath making leaves curl black. Others claimed she had stepped into the rivers, her voice lingering in the water, poisoning those who drank without respect. A few believed she had simply kept walking, carrying her hunger, her pain, and her fire far beyond the hills, a wandering ghost of vengeance, never sated, never forgotten. The truth mattered little. What remained was her legacy. A meal of cruelty had become the curse that fed them all to death, and her name, Kinna, the daughter of poison, outlived the village itself. And in the silence of every home where food was shared, her shadow sat at the table, unseen but never absent.